I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I'm just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
I am just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
Would you mind talking a little bit about the history of facial recognition technology and how it's evolved over the years and where you think it's headed?
Yeah, certainly. So, I think if you kind of go back, right, there's probably a couple different periods of the evolution of facial recognition. I think if you go back maybe, 7-8 years, right, it was a pretty, I think, early stage technology at that point, sort of, cutting edge. And while I think it worked at that time, there were a lot of imperfections, right? And I think that's where you started to see a lot of potential concerns and risk, especially, with sort of early implementations of it that were, maybe not as foolproof as people would have expected, right? So there were some kind of high profile scenarios where it just really didn't work well, right? So like one example, I'll mention. I think back in 2017, right, UEFA decided to use this for a Champions League final football match in Europe. Deployed this pretty widely across the stadium and sort of the outskirts, and it failed pretty spectacularly, right? I think they got a 92% false positive rate, right? So pretty much everyone that the technology picked up shouldn't have been picked up and identified as a potential criminal. Right. So there was a series of these kind of high profile failures where I think people really decided to take a step back and really think about whether the technology could be used in a widespread scenario, whether it made sense. Right. And I think, some of the challenges at that time were, lack of training data. Right. So the way that the technology was built was on a limited set of data. And so for certain ethnicities, for certain races, the results weren't as good. Right. So there was this inherent bias that I think people sort of came to realize maybe existed in these technologies because of the way they were built. So I think after that, there was this period to, try to refine the technology and get it better and correct for some of these biases, right? Improve the training, improve the way these models are designed so that it was more representative, didn't necessarily bias against, for example, people with darker skin color. Right. And so I think you saw a set of improvements around that. And then I think also, when COVID came about, right, then all of a sudden you had people starting to wear masks, which then impacted the technology and the usability as well, because that wasn't really what this technology and the algorithms were used to, right? They were sort of used to seeing the full face, and now you only had half the face. And so there was kind of another set of evolution, I think, around that time where the technology got sort of better because it was retrained again to deal with less of the face being visible, right? And so I think that and kind of all these things coupled together, and also more concern around just privacy and just the sort of reliability of the solutions, not trying to remove as much bias as possible, I think kind of got us to where we are today, right? Which is the technology as a whole is fairly good, fairly robust. Certainly, there's always room for improvements, but I think a lot of the problems you saw maybe 5 to 7 years ago with the technology have kind of largely been addressed.
No, absolutely. The bias has always been a concern. So let's look at some actual use cases. So Dennis, what are some use cases for facial recognition technology in schools, and how is it being used today, and what are some potential future applications of facial recognition?
Sure. So there's numerous ways it can be used, though. You can either do a watch list, which you create a watch list of people that you need to know about when they're in your schools. They could be people that have been trespassed or suspended students, or people of just of interest that the security team would want to know about when they enter. It's the same thing the security guards do now, or the school security officers do now. They essentially have a book of people or photographs that they review and keep in their mind to know, okay, these people aren't allowed in. That's probably the most simple, basic way to use it, and the technology would just alert the people behind the cameras that one of those people has crossed the camera and may be entering the facility. Another way to use it is access control. You can tie faces to any access control device. It's a more stringent use where you would enter all of the people in the school into the database, and you tie each one of those faces to a trigger, to a door or a turnstile or evolve system, however you want to access that facility. And then you would have kind of the third way where you wouldn't tie it to access control, but anybody that's in the facility or normally allowed in the facility, you would add them to your watch list, and we would do like a reverse watch list. We won't alert when those people that are supposed to be in the school come in. We would only alert whenever somebody that's not on the list comes in, somebody that's not a vendor, a teacher, or a student. So it doesn't necessarily trigger an event other than it alerts the security team, hey, there's somebody in the school that we should know about. And those are kind of the three uses that we see mostly employed today.
So, Kato, what about you? I mean, are there any additional use cases that you have experienced, or is Dennis's summation pretty accurate?
No, I think those are the typical three. I mean, I think just to maybe throw another example there, right around the first use case, around maybe people of interest, right? So we've kind of experienced this with some childcare facilities where they have situations with non-custodial parents trying to pick up kids when they shouldn't be. Right. So either it's not their day to be able to pick up the kid, or they're not supposed to pick up the kid at all, and they're there trying to, grab the child before the other parent shows up. So, I mean, situations like that where it can be effective, right? Because then there's an automated alert or some action by the security team to address the situation before, you sort of have a situation where the child went home with the wrong parent, right, or someone that they weren't supposed to. So, so definitely, kind of from that angle, that's probably the more common use case, right? Either blacklist or just trying to control access, really from the premises of trying to improve safety of the students.
I mean, Dan, you've been. Sorry, go ahead, Dennis.
Oh, that's okay. I'll just add one more thing here. We also like to add in those. I call it the custodial bucket of alerts where maybe two parents don't get along, and they notoriously cause problems or there's friction. We would also allow the security team to know when both of those folks are on the campus at the same time, so they can be available in case something happens quickly in those situations. It's also used. I'll touch on one more thing. What I hear a lot from administrators is, two things. One, time and attendance is a challenge. You can certainly do time and attendance with facial rec, which takes a lot of time off gives some time back to the teachers, and then suspended students. Even I know from my research that there's some of these events, these terrible events happen from students that shouldn't be in the school. They had been suspended or whatever, but it's quite a challenge to expect a security guard to recognize that, student A is suspended for these 7 days and student B is suspended for, 7 days starting next week. And it's just a real challenge. And we have a solution that allows those people to be alerted, the suspended students to come up on the watch list when they're suspended and shouldn't be in the school. So those are two challenges that I've heard from the field that would really be helpful to the administrators.
No, that's great. Thanks, Dennis. So from an education perspective, Dan, I mean, so you've been doing this for a little while, and I know you've always been welcoming to new technologies and trying new technologies. I mean, is facial recognition inevitable for every school, every college campus in the future? Is this the direction that we're headed in?
It's an interesting question. Before COVID, I had lots of cameras all across my campuses, thousands of them. And for me to want to put one of those in a classroom, it was blasphemy. There was no way that was going to happen. But suddenly with COVID, there's cameras being put in classrooms for hybrid instruction. So a lot of it's all of what's the use case, back to our original discussion. I think some of it will inevitably be for time and attendance or other uses that don't necessarily look like a security feature. Some might welcome it that way, and it may evolve into that. Or it may be initially for that security feature and evolve into the other feature. But I think it has so many uses that eventually, if they have existing camera systems, and maybe if they don't, they get them. I think somehow, inevitably, it's going to happen. Years ago, cameras were not welcome in a lot of places. Now it's inevitable. And there's such pressure on administrators, I would say all the way K through 12 and also higher ed, to be so secure with so many things. We were talking just a few minutes ago about knowing who can pick up a child, who can't, who's allowed to be in the building, those kind of things. And now there's also the reunification event. If something does happen, we evacuate much faster and close things down much faster than ever before. And if suddenly you're moving the children from one location to another, or if you're just even within a building, and I don't know the technology well enough to say if this is there, but I would think it certainly could evolve to that, where we say, okay, we know that so-and-so, the children are in this location, instead of running around with a checklist trying to find them. So I think inevitably it's going to get there. It's just a matter of, I think it'll take different routes.
No doubt. Cicada, you got some thoughts?
Yeah, just one thing I was going to add to Dan's comment around the proliferation of cameras, right? So I mean, I think you could almost argue that with all these cameras installed all over the place, I mean, facial recognition already exists, right? The ability to do it exists on every campus and every school, right? The only question is whether you're doing it manually, right? I.e. a security guard or someone in a security operations center looking at a video feed and trying to pick out a person, right? Which is, I would say, human-based facial recognition, versus a system doing it and kind of doing this in real time across 100 video feeds or 1,000 video feeds. But it's the same concept, right? You're trying to achieve the same purpose. It's just a question of whether it's automated and you're generating a ton of data, or whether it's kind of reactive, and human-based.
Well, and as we always, make the point that technology it's tools to help humans be more efficient, more effective, and that's what we're doing here. Dennis, I think you had a thought on that.
Yeah. So I just want to add a little stat that people might like. 80% of elementary schools have video cameras, and 95% of high schools are equipped with video cameras in the U.S. The number is probably much higher in Asia and other parts of the world, but that to the point, the technology's here and surveillance is being done, and just might not be facial rec. It's video surveillance for sure.
And that's one of the concerns. I mean, even leading up to this discussion, I heard from a number of folks, like they're concerned about being a state like China, where they're using surveillance in a very different methodology, like how privacy concerns. Those are all factors that obviously are prohibitive to some folks. So I mean, so what are some potential abuse considerations that can be taken into account when implementing facial recognition technology in schools? Well, so Kate, we'll start with you. I mean, what are some things that can be done from a policy perspective, from a technology perspective, to prevent abuse of the information?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, from an abuse perspective, right, I think there's some obvious things, right, in terms of now all of a sudden you have a lot of data available on, who's on campus, where they are, et cetera, right? And obviously that can be misused, right? So if someone's trying to be malicious and wants data on, when someone got there, or is this student in school, and now are they going to try to abuse that information? Then obviously that risk exists, right? So I think from in terms of mitigations, right? I mean, there's a couple of things, right? From a policy and governance perspective, I think it's important that the school understands, first of all, what they're trying to do with the data, right? So that the usage of the data kind of stays within the bounds of that use case. So there should be a very clear use case, and the data should be used for that purpose and should be defined, right? As opposed to just having facial recognition, collecting all this data just for the sake of having it. And then I think there's also a question of, tightly controlling who has access to the data, right, and what they're able to do with it. So, obviously, like the security team may need access to the data, right? But maybe the average teacher or administrator doesn't, right? Or there may be segmentations of the data that different people have access to depending on what their job function is. So I think all of those things need to be defined, right? Because what you don't want to have is sort of leave this open and have all of this data available for people to just use as they see fit, right? It needs to be tied back to the use case and the people, associated with a specific function that have a need to actually to use the data.
Dennis.
Yeah. So I think it's really, really important to have some strong policies and procedures around how the watch list is built. If you're going to operate in that model with some rules and regulations. People are on the watch list for these very specific reasons. And you have to keep in mind that if you're going to put, sex offenders on the watch list, some of those people need to get into the school to see their children. So you got to think through the reasons and for the watch list and work through the challenges and just make sure that it's thought through. Just don't put it into play without some thought. And I think that's why the technology has evolved to the point now where it's being used as, our facial rec companies are helping. We've seen the challenges and we can help our customers think about these things before they become a problem. So it's a lot of thought put into it. And also there's a misconception that the technology saves faces or detections. It's really we're really only detecting an algorithm. We don't have a cloud up there that's saving all the data. Almost all of our solutions are on premise, and the data is completely retained by the school. There's nothing more needed to do facial recognition than a student ID badge, and that is all maintained by the school and doesn't go outside of that ecosystem. So it's it really doesn't expose the IDs of the students outside of that ecosystem.
Dan.
Yeah, so there's we've touched on this about the policy, and I think everybody agrees that's really strong. But I would also, anybody who's considering this, think about who's going to own this data, because depending on where you are, how it's defined, if you have law enforcement within the college or university, they could have very different implications on a lot of things. So in higher ed, there's FERPA, there's rules about the dissemination of the records, and if it's a student record or not, and how it's kept and what its use is, we'll define that generally. I'm not an expert, but if it's a law enforcement record, it doesn't fall under FERPA. But then you have records retention issues and Freedom of Information Act issues. It all depends on how these things are defined in the use case up front. So I want to stress and back up what everybody's saying. How you define this usage is critical up front, I think, because if it does get tied into all these other student records of sort, and you have a records retention for one type of record, you've tied it together. Is there such a way to separate them later? And then who can get access to it? I don't know if it's possible, but I imagine at some point, if it's being used, say, for attendance or some other issue, it's being subpoenaed for a divorce case, or some other issue happens with a child and the parent wants it. Are we going to give them access to that? And how's it being defined and kept? Can that information be given to the outside, and what capability? Because it's just a matter of time. If it's in the schools, I would imagine it's going to end up in some other venue, whether that's the courts or the divorce court or any other place.
Along that note, Dan, Michael, by the way, if you have any questions, a few of you are starting to ask them in the Q&A. Just hit the Q&A button. You just type your questions in there. We'll get to those. Michael Prasad asks about thoughts on blending tech companies' product capabilities. So you mentioned like tying it to different databases. So like tying into like a sex offender database. Is part of a third-party integration to do different checks. Is that something that's something that you're considering? That's something that you are doing, or how does that data get into your system? Suketu, let's start with you. I mean, how does if you're doing checks against sex offenders or other areas of concern, how does that data get into your system, which then gets checked against the facial recognition detection?
Yeah, so I think maybe similar to what Dennis said earlier, right? It's as far as, what I call the enrollment process, right? So getting a person's biometric information into the system, it's as simple as a student ID picture, right, or a mugshot or whatever the case may be. But it's usually there needs to be that set of biometric data that comes into the system to really create the profile for that individual, right? And then that's what's used to be able to identify that individual going forward. So in terms of where the data comes from, right, it could be different sources, right? Obviously, if you're talking about students, it's generally the school's data, the student data system, which generally has images of the students. It could be other sources as well, right? There could be a database of parents, for example, who are maybe registered as volunteers to come into the school on a regular basis. And so their information, because maybe they had to go through background checks, right? So their information may be in the school system as just because they're repeat visitors. Same thing for potential, blacklisted or prescribed individuals, right? It may be suspended students, in which case, that data is coming from the school. Maybe, sex offenders that live in the vicinity that, maybe have had a history of being on campus when they shouldn't be in the past, right? And so that information, may come from the local PD. Maybe it comes from, the school's information if they've captured images of this person in the past. So it could be a variety of sources, right? But I think the point is, most facial recognition systems these days can take data from a variety of databases and sources, ingest it pretty easily and build the profiles of the individuals that are either on a blacklist or on a whitelist, right, depending on how you look at it, and then take some specific action. So it's I think that's kind of where the whole process starts, is the data, right, and it comes from various sources, and then based on the data and your policies, then you decide how you group the individuals, right? Whether they're maybe in a group of students or parents or restricted people or whatever the case may be. But then there's generally some groupings that get applied to these people, and then you define policies based on those groupings, right? So that's kind of the typical process for how you sort of set up and use the facial recognition information to actually drive a process or workflow.
Dennis, I mean, how widely adopted is this technology today in schools, to your knowledge? I mean, are we still in the very, 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 very early stages of adoption? Those, like with ZeroNow, we always focus on the visionaries, those early adopters on the front lines that are willing to introduce new technology, provide feedback, help shape that. I mean, where are we today as far as the adoption?
I would say I'm very familiar with that graph, and that's exactly where we are today. We're the the technology early adopters who or somebody that's had an event, one of the two, somebody that's feet are being held to the fire to do something with this really expensive video system other than mop up a situation. They've been given some keys and some budget to do something else other than use a video system to mop something up. So those are the two that I see. I think all of us in the facial recognition business are driving that adoption curve, and educational events like this are part of it. We getting people educated on what we do and how we do it, and the challenges is part of that that whole curve.
Dan, I mean, obviously you're retired now, but I mean, as far as introducing a technology like facial recognition to your college, what would be involved with that? I mean, is that something that's going to go through a number of layers of review and consideration from administration? It's not like just, hey, we're going to add a couple new cruisers, or we're going to add a couple more camera systems. I mean, is this a different type of consideration?
I think it is. I think it's the tremendous scrutiny that just the very reason we're having this conversation, and everybody, how they answer the poll depends on what it's for. So I think a lot of it depends on how it comes in, who introduces it, what the circumstances are. If it's coming on the heels of a great cause at the moment that the place believes is urgent, if there's been active shooters, or if there was a major incident at that location, if they're under Title IX pressure, because there's a lot of uses of something like this for Title IX cases. If you have somebody that's been given a no contact order and you want to keep them away, if you have threat assessment cases, you can use it for those. And so it depends on how it's presented, how it's sold. And ultimately, I think it also depends on who's going back to who owns the data. If in today's law enforcement world, police aren't the most trusted entity out there all the time. So it may come in as another, under another umbrella. And I think that it may be accepted a little bit if it's going to be, we just want to use this for the student's purpose. And then later on it evolves otherwise. So I think reading the room is so critical, because it could very easily get shot down. When we first put up cameras on the entrances, so for the college, it's an open college. You don't just lock the doors and have everybody check an ID. There's buildings everywhere. There's open doors everywhere. Put up cameras at the entrances so we can read the cars or have video of the cars coming in and out of there. It was a big deal, and it made some people very uncomfortable. And what I've come to learn, I have a saying that I use: safety is a feeling, not a fact. And what that means is, so what makes some people feel very safe makes others feel unsafe, or vice versa. Depends on your point of view and where, do you trust the people using it? So you've got to be very careful in your implementation, I think.
Dan, real quick, what's interesting is talking about, safety is a feeling. A good friend out in the West Coast at President University, before COVID, they did a climate survey. They wanted to gauge, what can we do to make you feel safer as a student? Right. The number one response was, who can guess? Not facial, but more cameras.
More cameras. Oh, okay. Yeah. Right. And you know what? If the police had put that survey out, it probably would have been a different answer.
Right. Right. Well, but you think, generationally, all of our children and grandchildren have grown up with a baby monitor camera in the room. So from day one, you've been under surveillance. And so I think there's a different perspective with a younger generation than than older folks like me, growing up in the 80s and looking at those considerations. But that is truly an approach to make students feel safe. Dennis, what are your thoughts on that?
So we talked about the adoption of the technology after something bad happens. That's a very quick, knee-jerk kind of response, and it's good that we're doing something. But the real organic, the adoption happens when we get these very early adopters start having successes. We start stopping things from happening, and we start being able to tell the stories about, hey, we're able to keep 5 bad guys out of this school because our technology is in place. And we are early in the process, so it's it's tougher to tell those stories now because we're in so few places. But those stories are going to happen. We're going to keep bad people out of where they shouldn't be, and that's going to drive real organic adoption of the technology, because superintendents will start talking to other superintendents, and police officers will start talking to other police officers about how great this was and how it helped them secure the school.
It's so difficult to be proactive, though, Dennis. It's just after the fact. There's a knee jerk and overreaction to a situation. Then you overcompensate, but being proactive and hopefully that's what we're trying to communicate here is the ZeroNow community, that this is a community that's about proactive approaches to prevention. How do we prevent harm from happening, rather than waiting till something bad happens? And in fact, in a couple months, we're going to be discussing the politics of school safety, because that's another layer that we have to address. So Kato, I'm sorry for ranting on that. You have some additional thoughts.
Yeah, no worries. I think around the proactivity, right? And I think to what Dennis is saying, right? There's obviously always a knee-jerk reaction when there's a sort of tragic incident, right? And then everyone's looking for ways to try to prevent that, which is good, right? But I think also when the technology is deployed and it's working well, right? You don't necessarily see it on a daily basis, which I think is also it's great, but it's also a little bit of a challenge because you don't get to show how well it's working on a daily basis, right? I mean, ideally, yes, you can say, hey, we prevented these 5 bad guys from coming into the school, but hopefully that's not happening on a daily basis at the school, right? And so a lot of times, the technology is working great, right? But you don't necessarily see the value on a day-to-day basis because it is just doing its job, right? And, it's really the one-off situation where something bad could happen where, you need the technology to do its job, right? But you don't necessarily get I would say the success stories on a daily basis, right? Showing how well the technology worked, because most of the time it's working great and it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But when you really hear about it is either when it missed something, right? Or if it wasn't there and it could have prevented something.
You're absolutely right. And that that feeds into the whole, justifying an investment in a safety technology when it's not being used every day. It's not a tool that's being applied. Oh, we caught 13 bad guys today. And that's just not how it works. And you hope that nothing happens, but it's working 24/7. It augments the human's ability to actually be effective in keeping the school safe. Dennis.
Yeah, and also having the reputation of employing advanced technologies and having a tight entrance, and people can't wander in and out of the school without being detected. Just that perception will stop things from happening. If a bad guy doesn't think that you have an easy target, may choose something else or somewhere else. So even if, like Cicada said, even if it's working every day and we're not seeing the benefits, they're going to know that somebody was stopped at the door and ID'd that wasn't known, and that perception of having a tighter facility will help.
Absolutely. So a couple more questions came in here from our participants. Remember, hit the Q&A button if you have questions. There's a number of comments in the chat as well. Let's see. Are there codes or Michael asked, are there codes or standards that apply in either K-12 or higher education? Are there specific laws that apply to facial recognition technology? Are there any laws specific to this? Dan.
Well, I'm certainly not going to try to quote you a lot, but yeah, that's happening fast. So pay attention, I would say, to your location, because what I'm seeing is there's localities that are implementing laws, there's states, and now there's even federal attempted regulation. And so in Maryland, for instance, right now, there's a bill that's trying to prohibit the use of it by law enforcement. This is a particular bill. But in Baltimore City, there's already the city government is not allowed to do it, but under certain circumstances. And I would assume that means schools as well. And then in the U.S. Senate right now, there's a bill called the Facial Recognition and Biometric Technology Moratorium Act of 2023. And in there, it's got a bunch of regulations and things they're trying to push through. I think it's just a matter of time. I don't think it's going to catch up in every locale, but I think it's a matter of time before everybody has something. So if I'm somewhere as an early adopter at a school and I'm bringing this in, I'm going to write as robust a policy as I can, as quickly as I can. So I already have that in place. So if somebody comes to me, hopefully I can then say, oh, I've already written this, and then they mimic mine.
No, that makes sense. John Bullwinkle, hey John, asks, is there a higher level? We'll gear this towards Cicado first. Is there a higher level of accuracy if schools have images, ID pictures available? You touched upon that before, but does that improve the level of accuracy?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You need some starting point, right? And so whether it's an ID picture or you get new pictures taken of all the students. Obviously, you want some sort of source of truth, right, of what that student or what that individual looks like, which is typically part of the enrollment process, right, to get the data, to build out the database in the system. So, yeah, and generally what we see is, with that typical type of kind of headshot or typical, school or ID photo, right, that typically, especially with the technology these days, gets you very high accuracy in terms of being able to match and identify individuals based on a single photo. So you don't need, 10 photos of an individual to make a good quality match, right? You get that very high accuracy with, a single good photo, a headshot is usually all that's required to get very, very good performance these days.
Thanks, Saketu. George asks that you mentioned back in that in 2017, facial recognition had a 97% false positive rate at a football game. What would you say the accuracy is today?
I mean, I'd say it's almost the inverse of that, right? I mean, we've certainly seen it in I'd say almost all of our deployments where you're upwards of 99%. With kind of the normal, as long as you're in a normal environment, generally that's what the expectation should be, right? You're probably a couple nines of accuracy. But yeah, I mean, the technology is sort of, I think, evolved to the point where that's the norm, I think, rather than an outlier these days.
I mean, the same thing goes for any video analytic. I mean, it's, there's, you're obviously working towards 0% false positive, but even the human eye is not 0% false positive when visualizing things, identifying objects. Mr. Sweet.
Yeah, and driving that same topic, we will as a technology, we will not do well if we have a lot of false positives. It is inverse of what we want people to have confidence whenever we alert somebody that a bad actor is there. We want them to have incredible confidence that it's that person. It still triggers a workflow from a human, and that will never be replaced, in my opinion. And somebody there is going to have to go and lay eyes on that person to double check and make sure. We are simply a tool, but I fully agree that we're exact opposite of what that study showed from the football game. We're at least 97 to 99% for sure, in a very good situation. You can, and the school photos are perfect. That's a great situation. An ID badge. That's those kinds of photos are amazing. But you can also pull the photo from prior video, but you'll also suffer a little bit in the accuracy. But in a perfect world with great photos and really good situation on site, we're up there with 99% for sure.
Saketu.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, and I think we've actually been, and I personally, have been surprised by how good some of the technology has gotten. Right, where we've seen pictures of, especially in COVID era, right, where individuals, had kind of full mask, like covering their nose, right, had some sort of hat or headdress on that kind of went all the way down to their eyebrows, right? So they had very little of their face visible, and kind of even in poor lighting conditions, right? It was pretty amazing to see how well the technology worked. Where even as a human, like I had to, stare at that picture really closely and compare to the photo to really determine, was that the right person? Whereas, the AI, had no trouble making that match, right? So I think we've been fairly impressed with how good it's really gotten.
Oh, very cool. Dan.
This reminds me of kind of the evolution of within police work of IDing a suspect in a crime. And I know that's not everything we're talking about here, but back in the old days, it was get the bad guys and line them up and have the witness come in and pick them up and have them turn sideways. We've all seen that on television. Well, that's not done anymore. What's done, well, there's a lot of ways it's done, but now then it evolved into photographs where you put them in a certain order or something. You show them to the people and you say, do you recognize these people? And they look at it and they pick out the bad guy or they don't. And then it was required that we would have a double blind test in a lot of places. They say, okay, so if I'm the detective, I can't even know who the possible bad guy is. So where I'm headed, where I think this is headed in law enforcement, and it's probably there already, is there's a huge training element for verification. And I know we're talking about in colleges and in K through 12 as well. So I think there's going to have to be some of that also. It's not just automatic that the technology says, hey, this is Dan, and we go, okay, no problem. If it's a non-judicial thing, I suppose that doesn't have too much harm. But if it's a judicial thing, in law enforcement, I can easily see them saying this does not establish probable cause. I mean, you can't make an arrest just by this by itself. You have to have other evidence or other verification or a second person who's trained reviewing it. So I think that's where a lot of people are going to feel better about it if the training is there and there's some other human intervention, so to speak. We're not turning it over to the machines and walking away.
And that's it. It's all about, using technology as a tool to augment human ability, and that's what we always talk about. And there was a school safety director up in Maryland who is employing gun detection technology, because his quote that really stands out is, "There's no way a human can watch 1,500 cameras simultaneously. It's physically impossible. But when you employ video analytics to bring information to your threats to your attention, you can then address that, verify, proceed as you would otherwise." Very important. Dan, thought on that?
Oh, I agree with you 1,000%. I mean, there's the four of us on camera right now. I dare anybody to watch us all at the same time. You can't. So
I was trying to.
it's going to happen. I mean, we're all watching, but we really don't see everything we're all doing, everything that's occurring. And so imagine you've got hundreds of thousands of those cameras, and most places do not actually live watch their systems. Very few do across this country. I saw a statistic one time that I think put it less than 5%, maybe less than 10%. I don't recall. It's really, and even if you hire somebody to do it, there's the human element of fatigue. So it's inevitable, I think, that those things are going to get tied into it. It's just a matter of how do we keep it under control.
Exactly. Mr. Sweet.
Yeah. We also have the ability to use the technology, the video analytics. And it isn't just facial recognition that we do. Our companies also do analytics, and we help investigators or school officials review 30 days of video very quickly to see if somebody or someone was in the facility. So we not only do that, we can search for clothing combinations and all these other video analytics. I know we're talking about facial rec today, but the tools that are employed really do more than just recognize a face. They really help investigators and school officials review the video that they have very quickly for whatever they're looking for, whether it be clothing combinations, hats, masks, backpacks, whatever they're looking for.
Dan, just a quick point, and that's part of this conversation here. We haven't really said it covertly, or overtly. It's about prevention. We want to prevent harm by being proactive, staying ahead of it, identifying a threat, whether it's a potential sex offender, a potential parent that is a potential threat. It's rather than using cameras to go back forensically, look at the footage. Yep, here he is. He came in and left with the student. I mean, those are things that we want to get ahead of that. Thoughts on that, Dan?
Absolutely. And earlier today I was having a conversation with somebody who's in the communication field, and this was a topic we were having a discussion about. And the topic became, okay, is it more than just registering a face? Can it actually pick up on emotions, and can that be recorded and alerted? And what are the implications of that? Does it help from a safety perspective, or could it be used in other ways for people who are problems in a school or something? I'm asking Dennis and Sakito because I don't know.
Sakito.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Yes, the technology certainly exists to go beyond the face and look at emotions and behavior and other things, right? Like we were talking about, detecting fights, right? Aggressive behaviors. Well, I mean, those capabilities exist, right? I think again, it kind of goes back to, especially when you talk about emotion, right? The question is around what's the intended use case of that, right? Is it to say, this individual looks extremely angry coming in the door, maybe someone should go have a talk with them, which may make sense, right? But there's always, I think that's one where there's maybe kind of a fine line, right? With how you're using the technology, and are you trying to interpret too much from what it's telling you, right? And is there, it's not like facial recognition where there's a very clear, almost like a binary decision, because the technology is so good these days as to yes or no. Is this person that I saw on the video, does it match this other individual, right? That's more of a kind of binary decision, where when you talk about emotion, it's a scale, right? And so then there's a question of how far on that scale is okay with any sort of emotion before you need to react to it. right? And there's obvious differences between how people react, right? So an emotion is not an absolute, right? Someone may generally walk around with an angry expression on their face, right? And that's just how they are. Doesn't necessarily mean they're out to do harm, right? And so I think it's certainly a finer, more nuanced area, and that's where it's harder to make sort of very discrete decisions just based on that one piece of data, right? And in terms of what an algorithm is telling you about emotion.
Dennis.
Yeah, our technology today, as we deploy it in any schools, retail settings, wherever, it is simply face matching. We are matching a face to a face, an ID that you may have to somebody that walks through the door. Technology has all these things in the future. We can look for. I'm not saying we are, but you can look for gestures and raising your hand. And it looks like a fashion that somebody would raise their hand to shoot a gun or something, but what we have confidence in is today we can face match at a really high level of accuracy. And I think it's important to stay there until everybody feels comfortable about all these advanced things, or we haven't learned from the past. And I think it's really critical that, us technology leaders do what we do well and move forward when the customers tell us that they're ready to move forward.
And that's part of the ZeroNow, the I would say manifesto, but it's our responsibility, right? As creators of technology, those that are keeping people safe on the front lines, it's our responsibility to find new ways to keep people out of harm, students out of harm's way. Gary Sigris, okay. So Gary asks, is there anyone on the panel who can speak to the technology, to this technology and how FERPA fits in? This is important. I think Dan might have some information, and Gary and everyone on here today. So we're gonna run out of time very soon. But as soon as we're done here, if you could jump into the ZeroNow community, just go to zeronow.org, click on community. We already have a new post in here with a continuing Q&A. So any questions that were not answered here, additional thoughts, or if you have any additional questions for the panelists, please go to the community and post those. We'll post the replay of this later this week once that's available in there. Dennis, thoughts on FERPA?
Yeah, so I'll qualify. I'm not a FERPA expert, Gary, but I can tell you that we don't do anything differently than what is at the school now. If there's a student ID at the school, that's the photo we use to match the picture. There's no data collected on our end that would would be any different than what the school is doing now. So there's no mass data collection going on with the solution that we have or the solutions that I've seen in other situations. So I don't see how it would be a FERPA violation, since all we're doing is matching a face that's already in the database of the school and alerting, and there's no data saved for future reference outside of the retention period.
Dan.
I think this is yet to really be ruled on at some point, but for me, my gut feeling is it depends on the cameras, because it's tied to the cameras. So video is being collected now. How is that tied into it? Going back to my last location, we had an ongoing debate about that because we bought the cameras for law enforcement specific under law enforcement specific grants. We maintained them. I controlled who had access to it. So we had a very strong position. These were not under FERPA. However, we had the debate of others, including attorneys, who said, no, these are still school records when you're capturing student information in those certain ways. And so we got into some very heated discussions. But I go back to what is your camera policy as it relates to FERPA, because that's how you're capturing it. And although it may not be saved in the same server, I think if you've already gone down that road, I don't know how you extract yourself from it not being a record if everything on camera is already a record.
We have time for one more question here. Let's see here. George asks, is this technology easily and relatively inexpensively is compatible with most existing cameras? I mean, do you need special cameras to run facial recognition analytics? Cicada, we'll start with you.
So I think the short answer is no, they're not usually special cameras. I think it comes down to more placement of cameras. right? So making sure the camera's in the right place to be able to, get a good image of the face of people coming in. And especially if, there's a lot of people coming in at the same time, obviously the camera needs to be able to, see each individual face, right? So it's probably more along the lines of, like I said, the placement of cameras and maybe ensuring that that there is some sort of flow of people coming in where they can be seen by a camera, because obviously if you have large groups of people coming in and the camera is at an angle where certain people are going to be obscured behind other people, then obviously you're missing individuals that come through, right? So it's more about I think placement and optimizing that versus any specific type of camera.
Dennis, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, any camera works is with a bit of a qualifier. Digital camera within the last 10 years is certainly better, but there's ways to even get around that. But yeah, as long as it's a decent quality camera and it's positioned in a way that allows us to see the face at not an incredibly steep angle, not straight above, but we can work with almost any camera that's in place. We're an open company. We work with servers and VMSs of any kind. It's really a plug and play kind of solution.
Just to be clear, but IP-based cameras, you're not running on analog, right?
Yeah.
Analog feed.
They have digital converters that they can put on those, and they work, but it's certainly not ideal. So.
My bank still is running an old analog camera, I think from 1986. I mentioned the 80s before, yeah. But so listen, we're out of time for questions, and so before we ask our panelists to get their final thoughts, final words of wisdom to close things out, so we want to remind everybody, please go to the community website that will continue. We have a lot of questions that we did not even get to, a lot of questions that came in from registrants. So we'll post those questions in there. If you have additional questions or you want to share your experiences and insights, please post that in this discussion. If you're interested in being a panelist, join the ZeroNow community. We do call for presenters or panelists that we're not presenting, panelists. So check out the ZeroNow community. We'll start with Dan. Final thoughts and words of wisdom that you want to leave for our participants.
I don't know if they're words of wisdom, but I use this a lot in my problem solving, if that's what we're working on. How you define the problem is how you come up with a solution. So as you present this, if this is something that you're looking to go forward with, think of the multiple uses, try to in advance before you present it, so you know what the pros and cons are, so you're not surprising anybody. Never ask a question you don't want to hear the answer to. So instead of making a yes or no, give the options to whoever the decision maker is above you. And if it's safety and security is your number one, I'd always have that extra little thing in the background in case they decide they feel safe enough already, but you still want to go forward.
No, good stuff. Thanks, Dan. Suketu.
Yeah, maybe just I think say what Dan said in a different set of words. I think it's really about starting with understanding what the problem is, right, and what the end goal is that you're trying to achieve. And that should really be the approach, right? It's not about trying to throw some aspect of technology in there just for the sake of having technology, right? There's plenty of technology available, but it's really making sure you understand, what the problem is that you're trying to solve, and then finding the right technology to fit those needs, right? It may be facial recognition, maybe something else, but I mean, I think that should be kind of the approach that's taken, and then you'll generally end up with the right answer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Skato. Yeah, there's nothing as a technology enthusiast, I agree 100%. There's nothing worse than using technology for the sake of technology. It's a tool. What problem are you trying to solve here? And how can technology help you solve that problem more effectively, more efficiently? And the final words of wisdom, final thoughts, Mr. Dennis Sweet.
Well, I'll piggyback on what you said. I was a purchaser of technology and when I worked for the state of Ohio, and there were closets full of equipment and technology that was never used. Really cool stuff. But there's an old friend of mine said it's cool versus compelling, and facial recognition is compelling, in my opinion, and that's why I'm with the company on that. I do believe that we have this adoption curve that we're all riding, and it's important that we all work together and put together some really good best practices, and we all share. This forum is awesome. I've seen some questions on that I'm going to dig into and enjoy looking at, and I hope to connect with the people that were on the participants today.
Awesome. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks everyone for participating. So a reminder, our next session is April 18th. We are going to look at how campus safety has evolved by remembering Virginia Tech. That was a pivotal point, a milestone in where we are with campus safety, technology, programs, technology, training, you name it. And so we're going to visit that and talk about where we're headed and what we've done to date. So once again, hopefully we'll see you in the community after this to continue this discussion. Wishing you all a great rest of the day and stay safe. Thanks out to our panelists too. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.